Hello everyone and welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into a truly dark but honestly absolutely fascinating chapter of history. We are unpacking the anatomy of a macabre trade, from grave robbers to serial killers. We're going to map out the wild journey of how a highly specific and frankly almost absurd legal loophole birthed a horrific black market that, believe it or not, completely shaped modern medicine. It's really a story of unintended consequences, where the pursuit of scientific knowledge collided right into the darkest depths of human greed.
To kick things off, I want you to imagine this scenario for a second. You are a 19th century grave robber. You're standing in a freezing cold cemetery in the dead of night committing a highly taboo, totally frowned upon act. Now, if you're going to take that massive risk, why would you take the extra time, in the pitch dark mind you, to strip the body completely naked and purposefully leave the clothes and any jewelry behind in the dirt? I mean, it seems completely illogical, right? Why not just grab the body and run, or, take the valuables with you to pawn later? Well, the answer to this incredibly specific behavior lies in the strange intricacies of the law at the time.
So let's jump straight into part one, the bizarre legal loophole. Now, the guys who engaged in this midnight harvest were commonly known back then as the resurrection men. And the really astonishing thing is that this morbid trade was able to function somewhat out in the open. We aren't just talking about a few rogue individuals here. It was an established underground economic. And it all hinged on one glaring, massive quirk in English common law regarding what actually constitutes property. You see, under the law, a dead body belonged to absolutely no one. Legally speaking, a corpse just wasn't considered property. Therefore, taking a body wasn't technically theft. It was just a misdemeanor for something called outraging public decency. The worst a resurrection man faced was a brief stint in jail or a pretty small fine. And here's the kicker. The medical schools that desperately needed those bodies for anatomy lectures, they'd usually just pay that small fine for the grave robber. But clothes, burial shrouds, rings, jewelry? Oh, those were legal property, and they belonged to the deceased's family. If a body snatcher was caught stealing a corpse that was still wrapped in a burial sheet or wearing a ring, well, they had just committed grand larceny. And the punishment for that? Hanging or being shipped away to a penal colony. So, to put it simply, steal the actual person, get a slap on the wrist. Steal the person's shirt, go straight to the gallows.
And this perfectly explains why the resurrection men operated the exact way they did. Their behavior wasn't driven by some weird, creepy ritual. No, it was a highly calculated legal defense strategy. They had a meticulous method to avoid the noose. First, you dig up the grave. Second, you carefully strip the body entirely naked. Third, you actively toss all the clothing, the shrouds, and the jewelry straight back into the coffin. And finally, you fill the hole back up. By leaving the actual property behind, they ensured that even if the authorities caught up with them on the road to the medical school, they could literally only be charged with outraging public decency. Pretty clever, right?
But as the years went on, the public caught on to the game. Which brings us to a much darker chapter. Part 2, Escalation to Murder.
You see, families were absolutely not going to just sit back and let their loved ones be dug up for science. As the supply chain was threatened, everyday people began fighting back, using these formidable iron cages called mort safes. These heavy cages were bolted directly over fresh graves to protect the dead from the body snatchers. Other families actually pooled their money together to hire armed night watchmen to patrol the cemeteries. Now, hauling a dead weight out of the ground in the dark is hard enough. Trying to pry open heavy iron cages while dodging armed guards, that made raiding graveyards incredibly difficult. The supply of fresh bodies for medical science began to drastically dry up, even though the demand from universities for anatomical knowledge was higher than it had ever been.
So here is the absolutely crucial point. When supply is constrained but demand is sky high, the market adapts. And in 1828, up in Edinburgh, that adaptation was deadly. Two men, William Burke and William Hare, looked at the heavily guarded graveyards and realized something. They realized that waiting around for people to just die naturally and then trying to bypass those heavy mort safes was highly inefficient. They saw a wildly lucrative market in the medical schools, and they decided to just bypass the graveyard altogether.
This realization built into a horrifying, yet honestly chillingly efficient business model. Burke and Hare didn't steal the dead, they actively created them. Here was the playbook. First, they would lure poor, vulnerable travelers, specifically people who wouldn't be immediately missed, into a boarding house they ran. Second, they'd get these victims heavily intoxicated. Third, they would suffocate them. And this specific method of murder was no accident. It left the body completely intact without any obvious wounds that would ruin it for anatomical study. And fourth, they would bypass the middleman entirely and sell the pristine, entirely fresh body directly to Dr. Robert Knox, who was a very prominent anatomy lecturer at the time.
16.
I really want that number to just sink in for a moment. 16 fresh bodies were manufactured and sold by Burke and Hare directly to the medical establishment. They made an absolute fortune off of this grisly enterprise before they were finally caught. This wasn't just some one-off crime of passion, it was a sustained, calculated, serial-killing operation fueled entirely by the economic demands of early medical science.
And the truly terrifying part? Burke and Hare were not an isolated phenomenon. The financial incentives were just way too high. Shortly after Burke and Hare were finally exposed in Edinburgh, a very similar copycat gang, chillingly dubbed the London Burkers, was caught operating down in England. And their targets? They were caught murdering homeless children for the exact same purpose. The entire system of acquiring bodies for medicine had fundamentally broken down into outright predation on the absolute most vulnerable members of society.
So, how does a society even begin to fix something so broken? That brings us to our final section, Part 3, the Anatomy Act. The sheer, unimaginable horror of the Burke and Hare murders, quickly followed by the London burglars, completely shocked the British public. The outrage was absolutely deafening. The government finally realized that ignoring the realities of how medical schools acquired bodies was literally breeding serial killers. They had to act. So, in 1832, Parliament passed the Anatomy Act. Now, before this act, the only legal source of bodies for dissection was strictly limited to executed murderers. That was actually a big reason why the shortage existed in the first place. There simply weren't enough executed criminals to go around for all the medical students. The Anatomy Act completely abolished that old rule, and instead, it gave medical schools legal access to what they called unclaimed bodies. This single piece of legislation effectively killed the illegal resurrection trade overnight by finally providing a massive, totally legal supply chain. But we really have to look closely at who these unclaimed bodies actually were. They were almost exclusively the extremely poor. These are individuals who died destitute in workhouses or charity hospitals. Crucially, they were people who simply lacked the family or the funds to pay for a proper burial. So, while the Anatomy Act absolutely flooded the medical schools with legal corpses and permanently put the grave-robbing resurrection men and the murderous Burkers out of business forever, it came with a massive moral cost. It essentially shifted the entire burden of scientific progress squarely onto the shoulders of the poorest, most disenfranchised people in society. The state basically legalized using the destitute for science.
And that leaves us with an incredibly profound question to ponder today. Does the foundation of modern medical science justify the grim, class-exploitative means used to acquire all that early knowledge? Think about it. Every modern surgical technique, every single anatomical textbook we rely on today to save lives, is built directly on the foundation laid during this era. It's a dark reality where the desire to heal tomorrow was fueled by exploiting the vulnerable yesterday. It is definitely a heavy thought, but it's an absolutely essential part of understanding the history of medicine. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, and I will see you next time.